All right, greetings everybody. I'm obviously Jesus, and welcome to the second Patreon video for the month of December 2018. Coming up on the end of the year very, very quickly. Alone for the holidays again. Yeet, dab. Um, I love being completely and totally isolated. It's great. I have two dogs that are my friends, and that's about it. But yeah, today's video, as I hinted at or suggested, it might be in the past video a couple weeks ago because we had an off week because there's 5 Sundays and Mondays in December. One of my patrons wanted me originally to do a video about Frank Yang and his sort of strange mindfuckery and philosophy videos, but instead, the patron asked me to change it to doing a response to a guy named Izal Mazard, I think. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He goes by, surprisingly, the foreign language moniker he has is a lot easier for me to pronounce. He goes by a-bas-le-ciel. And hey, that's 4 years of French right there. That's 4 years of public education. Working for you right there. But anyway, he makes videos similar to me, sort of in the sense that he talks a little bit about philosophy and veganism and stuff like that. And he's probably, from what I've seen, I don't know his like whole YouTube history. I don't know like how long he's been doing this or where he came from or what have you. But even though I don't know that, I have seen a few of his videos, just clicking around his channel. And if anything, he's more of a hardline vegan than me. Like he was going after like farm sanctuaries and stuff where people can interact with the animals and like talking about how they're exploited and stuff. Maybe we can do a video about that because I'm not entirely sure, where that falls in the ethical spectrum of veganism, where I haven't really thought about it. I don't really interact with farm sanctuaries or anything, so it never really crossed my mind. But yeah, there's I was gonna actually do a video where he was talking about secondhand leather and secondhand animal products and secondhand morality, but I decided that instead it would probably be a little bit easier for me to talk at length about a different video he made entitled #ReplaceChristmas. And this is it's not going to be, as antagonistic as my response to Sargon of Akkad was, where, I mean, that video was made well after Sargon posted his video about illiberal progressives, I believe it was. But so yeah, this is just going to be me riffing off, what I wrote down as notes when I was originally watching this video, where he's talking about essentially the idea that the subtitle or the alt title of the video is "New Atheism," quote unquote. I guess that he doesn't want to throw his hat into the new atheism ring, and who would really want to do that? So, but nonetheless, the subtitle of the video is. I'm quite tired, by the way. Sorry if I'm like jumping around and not speaking particularly clearly. But yeah, we're basically going to talk about my thoughts as I was watching his video, where he suggests that atheists, whether or not they be part of a movement or not, the need for new holidays to replace Christmas to get that sort of lingering Christian influence out of our lives. And we'll go through, the video's points pretty much sequentially here. Of course, it's going to help you a lot to actually go and watch this video on YouTube. It's only 14 minutes, so it's a little bit less loquacious than me. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. He's probably better at getting his thoughts out, just in a stream of consciousness than I am, certainly, and at least in a more concise manner. But anyway, we're going to go through the video, and it's going to be helpful, as I said, if you have watched that, so you might want to take the short amount of time and go watch that so you know what I'm responding to. But I will, pull quotes and reference what he's saying in the videos if you don't feel like doing that at this particular moment. But anyway, a-bas-le-ciel filters this this not necessarily a debate, but this lecture, this I'm totally blanking on the word I want to use here, through the lens of, him being a father. He says he's the divorced father of a 5-year-old child. And because he filters this through the lens of parenthood and, trying to make a better holiday for your child than just taking something that the Christians had and, keeping that influence in their life, I'm going to do the same as well for a good portion of the video. And this, goes right with the theme of my channel and my Patreon as well, because I'm always talking about, parenthood failures and antinatalism in general. But anyway, we're going to suppose that in this video we're going to be talking about hypothetical children I might have when I'm responding to his points. So anyway, moving on, here we go. We're going to talk about replacing Christmas. So I'll start off the video not responding to anything. I'm just going to start off the video, giving my sort of baseline here. I would say that if I were going to have a child, which I certainly will not, but if I were to have a massive change of heart and decide that I was going to procreate, I would likely celebrate Christmas with that child, because I did this exact same thing. Even when I was living just with my non-religious father after my parents got divorced, we celebrated Christmas. And when my family was together, my mom, who was always the religious one, the Catholic, she was non-practicing for most of that time, so we still celebrated Christmas, though, even though there was virtually no religious influence on our lives, aside from that time I went to a Catholic kindergarten, and my parents decided that was more than enough for me, because I did not like it. I did not take to the religious aspects of it, and as you might imagine, the teachers there were not particularly nice. I had a teacher named Mrs. Gazika. I think I don't know if that was the correct pronunciation. That's how my parents always pronounced it. I can't remember her saying it herself, of course, because I was so young. But yeah, she was pretty horrible. And that goes hand in hand, of course, with religion and Christianity, and specifically Catholicism. Very, very bitter people come out of a religion or a denomination of a religion that teaches you that you are an original sinner from birth. Funny how that happens. But yeah, regardless of how detached I was for pretty much all of my childhood from religion, I always celebrated Christmas because it was my family's traditions. My father had a family that was always like pseudo-religious, and they were more Christian than they were anything else, essentially, which is what happens in a lot of families in America, I think, as you drift away from the tradition of going to church and actually believing. You sort of just wind up passively believing, is what I feel is like my father's side of the family. And my mother came from a more religious family, as you might imagine, with her being Catholic and all that. But yeah, I definitely would not definitely, but I probably would celebrate Christmas with a hypothetical child of mine, simply because that's the tradition in which I was raised. And from a very early age, Christmas really only, maybe this was because I had such a shitty childhood, but Christmas was like a reprieve from the shit, and I would at least get material goods to compensate for my shitty life. And to be honest, that is what it continues to be to this day. My parents give me gifts still on Christmas, and will probably do so until they perish from this earth, because there's really no amount of material goods that can make it up to me, honestly. But it helps, and it helped all throughout my childhood as well. So for me, Christmas was not anything to do with Christ. I mean, I obviously understood that's where the holiday originated, of course, but for me, Christmas was always about material goods, a reprieve from my stupid parents. I could go get I would go on whatever new game console or new video game I got for Christmas, and, go in there and just be isolated from them and away from their bullshit. So it was always what Christmas was about for me. It was about that and a tree and presents. And if there had been no tree and no presents, or if it had, taken a different form, as long as I got that material goods and the reprieve that gave me from my stupid parents, it was good enough for me. So that was what Christmas was about for me. So I think a-bas-le-ciel is coming from a totally different perspective, and we'll talk about this as we discuss his points in the video, where he views it as a very religious thing, where it's very intrinsically tied to the Christian tradition. But for me, from the earliest days, it was always just about material goods. And I guess a happier version of that would be, having a Christmas that was, about a tree and gift giving and having good times with your family. But of course, I was not allowed to have that. But yeah. So, we're not going to talk about Santa in this video as well. I don't think I've made a video about Santa on this Patreon so far, but I did a couple videos about that back on the old Obviously Jesus channel, wherein I discuss how I believe that, in a totally secular objection, I truly believe that parents should not lie to and deceive their children unless it is absolutely necessary to preserve their safety and their health. Obviously, if This is a bad example, but if you need to, keep your child from touching the stove, and the only way they'll believe it is, if you if you tell them that there's a ghost haunting the stove and you can't go near there because it will get them and send them to hell or whatever, send them to the nether realm, I guess would be the secular version of hell. But if you were to tell them that, if that was the only thing that would get them to believe that, again, this is a pretty unrealistic example, but that would be a situation where if that was the truly the only thing your child would believe that would keep them from touching a hot surface and being disfigured and having a burnt hand for the rest of their life, then that would be morally justifiable, I think. But lying to your children for the purposes of giving them temporary enjoyment, which you then break like 8 years into their life. I think I was 8 when they told me that Santa wasn't real, or maybe it was 6 or 7. I honestly can't remember, but it was probably like 7 because I was going through the early divorce stuff as well. So, really, really great time in my life. Yeah, okay, maybe 8 actually, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. I just don't believe in lying to your child unless it's a direct issue of their health and safety. So we're not going to talk about Santa, but that's just what I believe as regards Santa. But this belief is this belief that it's okay to celebrate Christmas. It isn't tied to Christmas in and of itself. One of the things a-bas-le-ciel says early in his video is that you wouldn't have the same attitude about a Muslim holiday or a Hindu holiday with animal sacrifices or any kind of tradition that was different than the Christian tradition. But honestly, I don't necessarily believe that's true because this is not tied necessarily to a Christian tradition. It's just tied to it for a lot of people because that's what they grew up with. They grew up with either the Christian tradition itself or they grew up with the remnants of it, like I did in my family. But if I grew up in a part of the world, and I don't know if Muslims have any kind of, a Christmas equivalent that goes on in December, but if I grew up in a part of the world that had a major holiday celebration at this or any time of year with aspects like the tree and wrap presents and stuff that you could appropriate in a secular manner, I would like to have my kids celebrate that holiday simply to, make their life and their existence and their coexistence in a community just a little bit easier. So I disagree with his assertion that there are no secular people out there who would advocate appropriating a non-Christian celebration in this way that we do with Christmas a lot. I don't know of any person who's done it, of course, because I grew up in waspy fucking Rhode Island and I still live in that area. So I don't know anybody who celebrates a secularized version of any kind of Muslim or Hindu holiday, but I would not be morally opposed to it if you just took the aesthetic of that holiday and turned it into something that you could celebrate otherwise in a secular manner with your child, just to help them experience the holiday and in a way that doesn't have all the irrational religious bullshit, but also helps them not feel left out from their larger community, which is important to children because you can't just have your children at home living in a little bubble. Invoking the animal sacrifice thing was kind of a non sequitur to me as well, because obviously as a moral agent, your overriding concern in that case is that your child needs to not be participating in the death of animals or death of any creature, and you shouldn't be teaching your kid to normalize that. So that isn't really a salient point to me. The whole bringing up animal sacrifice is you don't even get that far. You don't even get that far when you're considering, because there's overriding moral objections before you even get to the idea of practicing that in a secular manner. So anyway, moving on from that, as a parent, I do feel like there is a certain obligation, certainly core obligation, to not have your kids needlessly ostracized from society and feel othered, because as long as it wouldn't hurt them or deprive them of any opportunities by allowing them to fit in, as long as you're not stifling their unique nature, I think that, pushing your child as a parent, because you have this really complex, high-minded view about what's going on, pushing your child to, have different traditions than everybody else, that's more about you, I think, at that point than about your child. Your child just wants to fit in. And, maybe it's irrational and naive to want to fit in such a way. But again, as long as you're not stifling their individuality, helping a child fit in with his peer group and his community at large is perfectly healthy and I think is a moral obligation to some degree. I remember I was crying in a car when I was very young to my mom because literally every child in my school, it seemed to me, at the time had a Motorola Razr flip phone, which was at one point the thing that was in vogue, and we were too poor to get me one, so I was just despondent because I could not have a Motorola Razr and fit in. And maybe this was my version of, Christmas. I don't know how I would have reacted to not having Christmas and seeing everybody else pretty much have Christmas in the area, but I probably wouldn't have felt that good. But for me, technology and stuff, material goods was always particularly important to me. So to be ostracized from something that was seemingly ubiquitous and people were enjoying at the time, that was really painful to me. So as a parent, to take a high-minded, a philosophical objection and put that on your kid, I think again that just says more about you, and it's more for you than for your child's benefit, honestly, because there is no, and this is going to be a key point of the video as we go, there is no inherent harm in having a tree and having rat presence. If Jesus never comes into it, there's no inherent harm there. They don't have to be intrinsically tied together. For example, to go back to what I was just saying, though, with having your kids or having an obligation to not ostracize your children, for example, having my kid not believe in Santa would probably make my kid a little bit of an outsider if I were to have a child. If I were to tell my child that, Santa was just a lie that parents make up, if he went to school and started spouting that, he would probably get in some kind of trouble. His peers would dislike him, and he would probably get called in the principal's office or something like that. And honestly, there's a little part of me that wants to have a kid so that I can go into the principal's office and defend my child, because it's like a fantasy fulfillment thing for me, because my parents, especially my father, were always very quick to take the side of disciplinarians, like even if they were wrong. Well, actually, no, hold on. I need to give them credit where credit is due. There was one time, this is a complete aside, by the way, but this is a fun fact, and this is something my father reminds me of all the time when he wants to feel like a good parent. There was a time when I was in early grades, and we were learning the difference between facts and opinion. And you had to take a statement and say whether or not the statement was fact or opinion. Um, and I forget what it was. Okay, the statement was the first people to explore Antarctica were brave, or it was like two women who ventured to such and such a place in Antarctica were brave. It was some big exploratory feat involving Antarctica. That's what matters. And I put that was an opinion, because it is an opinion that's brave, because it's not a fact. Because you could just as easily say it's stupid to go and like freeze your ass off for virtually nothing, or for science if you don't value science. So the teacher marked that wrong because they said it was a fact. But my father, to his credit, went to school and he talked to the teacher and got them to change that. So he had some balls in that way. But in another sense, in a lot of other cases, I remember my parents taking the sides of disciplinarians. I remember there was one time when I didn't want to shower for gym, or I didn't want to take gym class at all, and I got like lunch detention for it. And or I got actual detention for it, as it happens. So I got actual detention, and it was the first time I ever got detention, and probably the only time I ever got detention. Sorry, if you wanted, I should put an annotation or something to let you skip past this weird ass, boring personal story. But yeah, I was hoping against hope that my father would come pick me up and say, "Oh, okay, well, you're not keeping my son after school because this was a reasonable thing." I wanted him to identify with my rationale and go against the school. And he didn't, of course. So I had to once in my life, the straight A student served served after school detention, which was like horrible to my psyche then, as you might imagine. As I've talked about, I really valued my academic performance at that time. So, I fantasize about, being a parent sometimes, just being able to rescue my kid from that situation, taking their side, being completely invested and totally willing to validate their emotions, and tell the school or whoever to fuck themselves, no matter how rule abiding they were being, or no matter how they were just doing their job. So I have fantasies about that. But anyway, as I was saying, if my kid went into my hypothetical child went into school and told people what I told them about Santa, that it's not true, he would probably get ostracized, or perhaps they would try to discipline him, and I would fight them tooth and nail, because telling the truth should not be discipline or cause for discipline. But it's, even though that might cause him some grief, deceiving him for 8 whole years of his life, or 8 Christmases of his life, I don't think is worth it. I don't think that that's one place where you should just get along, because that's what I value, and that's how I feel about parental deception, even well-meaning deception. But yeah, as I've gotten older, especially as I've lost my attachment again to academic and career success as overarching values, I've grown to see the value of being more normal, or at least not actively resisting normalcy in innocuous ways. There's no value in being abnormal if you have to try to be abnormal. Like, if you wind up being abnormal, that's totally fine. If you wind up not fitting into society in one way or another, totally fine. But to force it for the sake of, I don't know, status, or for the sake of your own idiosyncratic identity, just to force anything about your identity is not worth it. And the same goes for trying to be so different from the norm that it harms yourself or your child. But anyway, moving on, the next point a-bas-le-ciel brings up is that there's a lot of people who celebrate Hitler's birthday. There are not a lot of people, but there are certain sects of society that do celebrate the birthday of Adolf Hitler, which I believe is 420. Smoke it. But anyway, I'm glad this is a fucking paywall thing, because that would be a meme. For those of you who are listening on the enthusiast version, I was just dabbing at for the second time in this video, which is shameful and terrible. Happy birthday, Mr. President. But anyway, a-bas-le-ciel brings up a point of, why is it okay to celebrate Christ's birthday when Christ was, not 100% confirmed to be a real person. He might just be a mythological invention. And B, Christianity is, certainly to blame for more deaths over the course, of all of history than Adolf Hitler, because, it just had so much time to go. So why are we celebrating Christ's birthday when he is the inspiration for countless deaths, and also may not have even existed? So to address that point, again, we can appropriate, and this is really the crux of the video. Again, we can appropriate the name and the visual aesthetic of a holiday without ever actually sparing a thought for the actual birth of Christ, whether or not it was a mythological invention. It doesn't have to be tied into that. For me, and maybe, this is just our difference of upbringing, for me, the Christ and Christmas means literally nothing. It like, I have to stop and think, oh yeah, that's the Jesus. That's the Jesus dude. So, I mean, I know that it is cognitively, but it's not what comes up. And maybe that's just because I grew up in a family that was not in touch with religion at all, thankfully. But again, it doesn't have to be. That's proof that it does not have to be intrinsically tied together. You can say, oh, Christmas denotes Christ, and yeah, sure, but we can get very, very far away from that actual meaning. It's just a name. It's nominal. Words change. Life is a dynamic, dialectical process, as my therapist always says. So yeah, we can appropriate the name and the visual aesthetic of a holiday like Christmas without ever actually sparing a thought for its namesake. Christ also, if we want to assume that he's a real person, Christ also had plenty of teachings in the Bible that were consistent with secular humanism. There are some that are not, like I come with a sword, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of, conflicting shit about Jesus and his persuasions. There's a lot of teachings in the Bible from Jesus, supposedly, that are consistent with, secular humanism, just being good to your neighbor. Love thy neighbor is, a core tenet of everything. And, we could, and absolutely, surely some people out there already do, use the time of Christmas to focus on those secular humanist values rather than anything to do with, divine birth, half human, half God, who is also God, and there's this Holy Spirit thing. We don't have to focus on any of that irrational, nonsensical shit. We can just focus on, we can absolutely cherry pick the good of the holiday spirit, so to speak, and leave the rest. And that's a privilege that we have as new atheists, or as atheists, that religious people do not have. The Bible supposedly is written either by God, or it is, transcribed by people who are flawlessly interpreting the will of a creator, right? So when people read the Bible, or when people get called out, religious people get called out for not following everything from the Bible, they don't have an excuse except to say, "Oh, they have to say that essentially, when they get called out for all the crazy Old Testament shit that's homophobic, or that tells you not to wear wool or not to grow a beard or whatever. Like, there's some crazy shit back in the Old Testament." But when people get called out for that, they just basically have no option except to weasel out and say either that, oh, the translator of God's word was imperfect, or what have you, which is not consistent with how the holy text is viewed. I mean, there have been different periods, by the way, throughout history, I have to give credit, where, the views on the Bible's legitimacy and how infallible it is have changed. But there are people out there who believe that the Bible is directly the word of God and is flawless, but also tells you to hate gays and not grow a beard. So they really haven't. I don't even know what kind of mental gymnastics they have to do to get out of that one in their own heads. But we have a privilege as atheists who don't believe that anything is coming from an infallible source to, take what we want and leave the rest. And that is something that I absolutely advocate people doing for your own benefit or your child's. And if you're, it's kind of funny as well how he formed his argument here in this point, because if you're going to cast doubt on whether or not Christ himself actually existed, you certainly cannot then in the same breath lay the body of atrocities committed all across time in the name of Christianity at Christ's feet, because if Christ didn't exist, then he cannot be blamed. The ideology has to be blamed, but you can't criticize people for celebrating his birthday if he didn't exist, because then I don't know, it negates itself. How can you blame, how can you say that a person didn't exist and also blame them for atrocities anyway? As I said, you have to blame the concept. You have to blame, those who continue and have in the past perpetuated Christianity and its hateful side, to this day and throughout history. That's where the fault lies. The people who, take the ideology and use it to inspire these things. But if you're going to say that Christ himself didn't exist, how can you then say, oh, he's a terrible person for all these atrocities that followed, don't celebrate his birthday? And you can't lay that blame at the specific holiday of Christmas either, because it's just a time. It's just a 24-hour period, or a 48 if you want to count Christmas Eve. But again, it's right to lay that blame on the whole of Christianity. But how can you do that? That has to be organized Christianity. You can't lay it at the feet of Christ, and you can't lay it at the feet of a specific period of time on the calendar. But anyway, moving on, because I have vegan cookies in the kitchen, and I am dying to eat them. They smell very good. But moving on, there is no reason that the aesthetics and the traditions of Christmas, like the tree and the presents, etc., have to be thrown on quote unquote the dustbin of history. And this is just me essentially at this point reiterating what I said earlier. We don't have to tie the two together. If anything, having an atheist holiday that shamelessly borrows from any and all traditions that it likes, taking the good and leaving the bad and leaving the illogical and the mystical behind, instead focusing on a time of unity and gift giving, perhaps even to the point of emphasizing the materialistic element and the progression of technology, that could be seen as even more of a powerful destroyer. We don't have to rest on our laurels, as a-bas-le-ciel suggests, or that people are doing, and saying, oh, Christianity is dead, we've defeated Christianity, while still celebrating Christmas. But I think that, materializing Christmas and taking what we want from it and leaving the Christ out of Christmas, I think that's probably the best revenge than, making up our own weird holidays, or making up our own individual holidays, or making up a whole new atheist holiday that we try to get people to coordinate. I mean, I think we would be a laughingstock if we did the latter, but stealing from Christianity and saying, oh, no more Christ, but all this other good stuff stays, I think that's more of a powerful statement than, being the weirdo in the corner celebrating their own weird secular humanist holiday that two other people on the entire planet would celebrate. Surely stealing and appropriating and being proud of it is more effective than trying to get everybody who has come to atheism for so many different reasons, from so many different traditions in the past and their families, on the same page in some ridiculously comical effort to celebrate a new slate of holidays rather than Christmas or Easter, etc., etc., etc. How would you even coordinate that among atheists if you tried to make a new unified atheist system of holidays? How would you do that? Facebook pages? Like, the scattered nature of atheism necessitates that we appropriate what's good for ourselves and for our families over inventing something new and universal. And it also, I think, not as strongly, but it also, I think, condemns inventing something new, because especially for kids, they're going to be the ones getting laughed at in the corner and feeling left out and being a laughing stock, and people are going to rightly wonder what the hell you're putting your child through that for, when you could simply just acquiesce. And again, this is one of those things. Because we don't have to have the Christ in Christmas anymore, I mean, I don't know how to establish that besides saying, you don't have to think about Jesus if you call it Christmas. Even if you call it Christmas, you don't have to think about Jesus. I don't know how to or intellectually support my argument other than you can think about this in a different way. But yeah, why would you, again, as I said earlier in the video, why would you push this on a young person who simply wants to fit in and isn't trying to rebel in that way that you are? Why would you do them that disservice just to feel like you need to create something entirely new? Nothing is new, really. I mean, if you're going to be creating a holiday, you would be, creating it, it would have similarities to Christmas anyway, certainly, so your child wouldn't be missing out on the core experience of the Christmas holiday. So, even if you were trying to replace it with, as he says later in the video, like a holiday celebrating Socrates and early Greek philosophy, acknowledging its flaws, but celebrating its formative role in all of secular humanism. But anyway, I just don't understand why you would push that on yourself or your child, when you can simply just think about Christmas in a different way. You can even change the name to Festivus or Xmas or whatever and still do the tree and the presents. I don't know why you would opt to take on the creative challenge, as he calls it, of forming an entirely new holiday that, by its nature for your children is going to ape the experience of Christmas anyway, when you could just pick and choose stuff that already exists and have a whole easier time for yourself and for your offspring. So again, he's talking about people who say that they're resting on their laurels and saying that they've beat Christianity, but in reality, all you need to do to beat Christianity is dispel their belief in supernatural phenomena and not pass that on to the next generation. Having this ridiculously higher standard where we're competing against the iconography of the Christmas tree, the Sistine Chapel, all religious art and music, is detrimental not only to oneself but to the children, where that I believe genuinely that a-bas-le-ciel is trying to protect. But the fact of the matter is, the world is not black and white like that, where you cannot separate one part of a thing from another, one part of a concept from another. If you want this new atheism movement that is based around a lack of belief, then all you have to do is simply make that movement about extracting the best of the best from the past and integrating it, into a new secular humanist future. Which is to say nothing of the massive bodies of work that we already have, of, let's say, music by atheist artists, architecture by atheists, atheist painters, etc., 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 atheists, secular people in all disciplines. There's already a massive body of secular art that you can show your children. Who would rather listen to religious hymns than fucking Bjork or, any of the million other artists who don't believe in God or who are agnostic about it? Secular art and art by religious people that is not about religion at all is already winning. We don't have to have this big thing. Like, passing on a tree and the iconography of the Christmas tree does not undo all the work that we've made, or that we've done. Not even directed work, mind you. It just doesn't undo the natural flow towards secular stuff that is already clearly happening, especially in art and music. I agree that it is not purely a destructive challenge, as he says, of raising a generation without these irrational religious beliefs, but it is a creative challenge. But that challenge does not fall to each individual parent alone. There is a massive body of work out there, pre-existing stuff that is secular, that we can draw from already, and we can also pick and choose what we want from religious tradition as suits us to make our children's lives as simple as possible and not needlessly push them up against society for our own, I don't want to say ego, because I believe this genuinely does come from a place of caring and of true belief that anything Christian is harmful. But I guess then it has to be fear. I guess then it has to be an irrational fear of Christianity. And believe me, I'm not one to advocate, Christianity as a good thing. I would not, teach my child to be Christian in a million years, no matter how, much easier I thought it would make their lives and their fears about death or what have you. But, I think that it is a very fearful position, and an irrational one at that, to believe that anything tainted by Christianity or ever associated with it is now and forever tainted and cannot be redeemed and needs to be completely destroyed and then replaced wholesale by something entirely new that has none of the elements of the old. I think that's an entire overreaction. Christmas itself was appropriated from pagan rituals in the first place. So I question why a-bas-le-ciel would even treat it like an original Christian creation that cannot be taken apart piecemeal when it was built piecemeal in the first place. It doesn't make sense to me. It seemed inconsistent with the origin of the holiday and with how people approach concepts in life. I think the crux of my response in this video, though, is that a-bas-le-ciel presupposes that we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, without really expounding on why we cannot treat a thing as a sum of its parts, or a concept as a sum of its individual component concepts. Be the thing a Christmas tree or the Sistine Chapel or any of the other things he names as, Christian iconography. Any new atheist holidays would be as arbitrary as taking some pieces of a Christian holiday and leaving another. So why make it doubly hard for ourselves in trying to fool ourselves into thinking we're making something completely original? a-bas-le-ciel then says he's attempting to create a new holiday for his kid, as I already touched on, a holiday celebrating Greek philosophy and Socrates and stuff. I personally have no again, moral objection to this, because I truly believe it comes from a place of caring. But this is the problem with any kind of atheism as a movement. It's so individualized, atheism is, based on how you come to it, that if your kid goes to school and says he's celebrating fucking Cuxmas or Socrates-mas, he'll get weird looks. But the truth of the matter is, you could just as easily call your Socrates-miss or Christmas or Cuxmas, whatever. You could call it Christmas and make it look like Christmas without any of the Jesus and no star, no North Star, no three wise men on the tree and whatever. And you could, give your kid the same amount of joy. Let's take it down to pure utilitarian brass tacks right here. It doesn't matter to your kid what holiday they celebrate. At the end of the year on December 25th or thereabouts, as long as they get some fucking presents and they get to eat a bunch of food and have some pie and whatever, you could have you can give your kid the same amount of joy by calling it Christmas and just erase whatever bit of social ostracism would come from having Socrates-miss, so to speak. That's what I mean when I say it's not about the child and his or her experience of joy at that point. It's about the parent and their own fears and their own apprehensions, because your kid will enjoy themselves the same way, regardless of what the holiday is called, as long as it has the same gift giving and secular aspects. And I am living proof of that, because my entire childhood was that. I could have celebrated Hanukkah, I could have celebrated Kwanzaa, I could have celebrated Cuxmas, I could have celebrated fucking Lysistrata. I don't know. I could have celebrated anything as long as I got some presents and could, have a reprieve from my insane family. It would have been fine. So I just think that, again, it's kind of like that the game theory thing. Why even bring in the possibility that your child is going to be socially ostracized when they go to your school or their school and tell them, "Oh, I celebrate Socrates-miss." Obviously, it wouldn't be called that, or I would certainly hope it wouldn't be called that. But why even bring the potential for social ostracism into that when they could just as easily, steal from better, more established traditions, have your child appear, normal, still maybe even emphasize Socrates, talk about Socrates or whatever, but take the aesthetic of Christmas, remove even the potential for any kind of weird blowback, however minor or major, and just give them the same amount of joy without any of the risk, is what I'm saying here. I think this is just an example of, too much focus being placed on the name of the holiday rather than what it celebrates, and in the case of these videos in particular, the actual experience of joy that your child is having. This video is framed as a video about parenthood, essentially, because children are the ones who get the most from holidays, as we know. So why infect the good intention of giving them joy with a bunch of, nominal hand-wringing, really? It's really, again, about the parents' hang-ups about the name and the aesthetic of a holiday, rather than the utilitarian benefit that you give to your child as a parent, rather. And I think that's kind of a fucked up situation of priorities. But anyway, a-bas-le-ciel mentions towards the end of his video that his father shockingly was buried, despite being an atheist and a communist, being buried in a Christian cemetery, despite his reservations. But ironically, it's funny he brought this up, because funerals are actually a perfect example of how, over generations and generations, secular people have taken the aesthetics of funerals and moved them into a non-religious context, with non-religious services, eulogies, epitaphs, funeral parlors, and cemeteries. There are secular versions of all those things. So by bringing up his personal connection and his shock at, his very atheist father being buried in a Christian cemetery in the end, I think that he sort of undoes himself by, bringing up an industry that has been, secularized, where obviously people still have tons and tons of religious funerals and stuff, and parlors are prepared for that, and cemeteries are prepared for that. These are industries that are extremely friendly and welcoming to secular people as well, because the world is getting more secular. So I think that funerals and the funeral industry is, again, just a perfect example of an industry that has, and a ceremony that has, like Christmas, adapted very easily into a secular way, that can coexist with the non-secular way, but still eschews all the Jesus and or the Torah or whatever happens to be your religious persuasion, and still gives the people the same amount of, not joy in that case as it would be with a holiday, but it still gives people hopefully the same amount of closure, and they still provide the exact same services. There's just no Jesus or what have you. I think that, honestly, a-bas-le-ciel's objection is rooted in this personal experience. And again, it absolutely does come from a place of wanting to protect his child. It comes from a place of concern. Above all else, I think that he wants to avoid the same future for his kids where they might slide back into, a Christian tradition, which I agree with him is harmful if you actually believe in irrational things like that. But I believe more in the validity and the power of atheism, either as a movement or as individuals, to pick from traditions and create something that is both secular and lasting, and leaving the past and the shitty shit behind. For me, as I said, with my upbringing, secular Christmas to me is as natural as breathing. And I wouldn't subject a child to whatever weirdness I might come up with just to assuage my own fears. Maybe an additional holiday celebrating Socrates would be cool, but at the end of the day, I feel that any Christmas substitute would simply be me making my own ideology masquerade as something that it just wasn't. I'd say, Christmas is a time when we come together. This is me to my hypothetical child. Christmas is a time when we come together with family and friends to celebrate and share gifts and reflect on the happiness that can be derived from coexisting in a wonderful community or family with each other, period. That's what I would say, and I think that's good enough. And to reiterate a counterpoint I already made, a-bas-le-ciel says at the end of his video, why don't you think it's harmless to take them down to the mosque and raise them with Islam? Well, I mean, it's kind of a non-equivalence, really, because you don't go to church on Christmas as a secularist, so you wouldn't be going down to the mosque if you were to celebrate something adapted from the Muslim tradition. But honestly, I would not be opposed, again, to borrowing the aesthetic of any Muslim holiday around the house and practicing whatever Muslim customs, without mentioning Allah or Muhammad or anything from the Quran or anything like that. I would be totally okay with myself, or, if I had a wife who came from a Muslim tradition or what have you, I would totally be fine with taking the aesthetics and the trappings of those traditions and just removing all the Allah and Muhammad and stuff from it, and still allowing my hypothetical child in that case to experience that little aspect of the culture without the irrational mysticism and the harmful belief. Because believe me, I do not think Christianity is harmless, but a tree with lights and presents wrapped in colorful paper, that's harmless. Are we, as new atheists, quote unquote, supposed to let Christians monopolize those icons forever? Are we too weak to take back a tree and presents? I don't believe we're that weak. I just don't. He decries, a-bas-le-ciel decries the pervasive barrage of advertising around Christmas, but if anything, the materialization and the focus on goods of Christmas has made it less about Christ than ever, so I think, again, he's defeated himself here. But anyway, I've talked for quite a long time. I don't want this to be perceived as a hate video. I like his other videos about veganism and whatnot. Although I'm not sure I agree with them wholesale, of course. But yeah, this has been my response to the idea of replacing Christmas. I figured I would do a season appropriate video here. So that's as we approach the Christmas holiday, of course, which I will be celebrating in essentially name only. I'm looking over here for your music recommendation for the week because I forgot to pick one. But oh yes, I did remember to pick one. I just forgot it. It is I've been listening to a lot of. It seems like all the albums I missed out on this year are female-led or female singer-songwriter stuff. So I've been listening to a lot of I talked about in the previous week, Goat Girl. And then I've been listening since then to Boy Genius and Soccer Mommy and Lucy Dacus and Camp Cope. But out of all those that I've been listening to, the one that definitely stands out is The Beths, a New Zealand band, I believe. The Beths, their album is called Future Me Hates Me. My favorite of all these albums that I've been catching up on as the year ends. I'll, of course, try to remember to put a link in the description. But yeah, that is The Beths, Future Me Hates Me. And I will, of course, leave a link in the Patreon post in the description of the video to a-bas-le-ciel's video, and so you can go watch it and form your own opinions and conclusions from it yourselves. But anyway, I've been obviously Jesus. I've talked for way too fucking long for something that is not incredibly complicated. But I will see you next time. Fuck Santa, though. Fuck Santa in his goddamn mouth. Oh, I got fucking cookies.